Podcast.
Natural experiment for researchers to test some of our craziest, wild hypotheses and assumptions. And we started talking about changing the dialogue within public sector and government to thinking about behavior change at a systems level, not just at the individual level. So I'm super grateful that Ruth has taken some time to share her ideas today and exchange her very unique perspective I had in this conversation. Thank you for joining us, Ruth. Namaskara.
Oh, thank you so much for having me. And you're absolutely right. When I was reflecting on our conversation, sort of in preparation, thinking about for me tonight, I know it's your daytime. I would agree. I think we started off sort of saying, okay, there was an agenda, and the agenda sort of flew out the window because there was just a lot of things, a lot to talk about. So very much appreciate everyone taking some time out of your day.
Starting off, maybe if you'd like to share, tell us where you're joining us from and what's exciting in your world at the moment.
So I am calling in from Chicago in Illinois in the US. And as you are probably aware, the US is not handling the pandemic particularly well. So what's new right now is I've been seeing the inside of my home pretty much 24 hours a day for the past couple of weeks. But it is, we're right at that point in the year when it gets dark very, very early and people are putting up their holiday lights. So they're actually, one of the things I remember enjoying about commuting, which I haven't been doing lately, is walking home from the train and seeing all the holiday lights up. So I feel like I'm getting a little taste of that now as we're sort of walking into the end of 2020.
Mm-hmm. It's been, such a challenging year for many of us, 2020. And I think it's also been a year for us to do some internal reflections and, really think about, think about the bigger picture, think about ourselves, our families, what matters to us. And also on a systems level, we've been thinking about and reflecting on what's not working for, many in our communities. There have been things which have been working well, and I'd like to maybe start off thinking about that and how we can start paying more attention and, tuning into what's already working well. And there's been a sense of gratitude, which we've been exchanging through these times. And there's a lot which we can be grateful for, which we tend to take for granted. Are there any positives you have from the year which you'd like to share with us, which you've taken on board?
Yeah, no, I think what you're describing is actually quite true, despite whatever day-to-day challenges there may be. I think one of the things I realize is also just feeling quite lucky in my circumstances. So that sense of gratitude for what we have and recognizing at the same time, absolutely, that there are a lot of people who are both suffering more and just also dealing and managing with so much. Even here in Chicago, there are areas in the city which are much more heavily hit by the virus, for example, and kind of recognizing that even, within your community or your backyard, really the distribution there. So very appreciative for my own good fortune, I would say. And also, recognizing that there still is sort of a good amount to be done and trying to do the best that we can to kind of bring that. I mean, we all, as being in the behavioral space, we all know that having habits interrupted is a pretty important thing. And I think this has been, as you say, sort of this interesting natural experiment. I think it's absolutely forced a lot of reflection on what is it that we normally do, kind of what are the norms of behavior. Even the idea here, at least, of getting back to normal has a lot more sort of importance to it because we don't really know what that normal is going to be just yet. So appreciating the small things, I think, has been sort of a theme over the past 9 months or so.
Mm-hmm. Thank you for sharing that. And then online discussion, I know, which in my preparation for this, which I listened to, which you had with the Institute of Design in partnership with the Action Design Network, you highlighted some of the limitations of behavioral science and its methods, and maybe that could be a good starting place for us. I promise not to take it personally as a behavioral scientist. I'll try to keep my own biases in check and pay attention and listen. But I'd love for you to share your perspective on this. Maybe starting off with a compliment to ease some of the pain I may experience. Yeah, if you can tell us what are some of the strengths you see of behavioral science, and what are some of the limitations in the scientific methodology?
Yeah, no, absolutely. And it is funny. I was in a conversation not that long ago where I feel like, oh, I'm always this contrarian and saying, well, what if we did this? And what if behavioral science did that instead? But I think it comes from a place of love. I really think behavioral science is amazing and fascinating and has so much to offer. And any of my contrarian tendencies, I think, are simply because I come from a different discipline. So my background over my entire career, although it's taken different forms, is I'm a designer. So initially, when I was early in my career, I worked in interface and instructional design. I then got a master's in design strategy. And so I worked in the strategy and innovation space for a number of years, almost 10 years or so. And I'm now at an academic institution. So the third act of my career is in the academic space. But I think that the reasons why I am both excited by behavioral science and behavioral design, and also hopefully like healthily skeptical about certain things, is that I do, as we all know, probably, right, when we are steeped in our own problem solving and our own ways of thinking, it can sometimes block us off from considering how other approaches may be valuable. And because I am a trained designer and a self-taught behavioralist, I recognize that even my backgrounds in both of those fields are a little bit different. But what I really enjoy, I think, is being able to bring a design mindset into how we think about behavioral problem solving. But just as much when I teach my design students, because I'm a professor of design, bringing behavioral thinking and behavioral insights and kind of forcing design students to really kind of grapple with and think about that. So I think I'm maybe a contrarian isn't quite accurate. Maybe I think I have a little bit a foot in both fields. And so therefore, I think I'm equally appreciative of both, but also skeptical of both. And sort of have that healthy critique sensibility, because I think they both have a lot to learn from one another. So I don't think designers have solved it all either. I think that there are definitely gaps in that methodology as well. And I just think it's interesting when we think about scientific methodology and design methodology. There are some things where scientific problem solving is 100% going to be a great solution. I do think that there are other challenges and other problems where that may not be the only right way to do things. But the fact that it's often data-driven and quantifiable can sometimes make it seem like, oh, that's sort of by definition almost a better way. And it's thinking like that I like to push back on. So it's all like I said, it's out of love and admiration rather than wanting to be sort of difficult.
And no, your interdisciplinary thinking and background really comes through. And as a practitioner, something didn't feel right at times, especially focusing on very specific challenges and certain methodologies which are proudly showcased as gold standard, like randomized control trials, for example. And I've, as much as I champion randomized control trials, I've been a critique of randomized control trials myself, because I think there's an acknowledgement which needs to take place that it's not always practical and feasible to control to give a certain group or exclude a certain group from a trial. And in certain circumstances, it's I think there's ethical questions to ask around randomized control trials. But also from a data point of view, I think there's when we flag something as gold standard, for example, I think it sort of indicates that anything else is substandard, which is not necessarily true. And there's been some work done by Angus Deaton and a few other economists in the space of critiquing randomized control trials because they're very context dependent. So just because we find that there's a difference between a nudge treatment and a control treatment, that doesn't mean that the findings are going to replicate at scale, because we found it for a very specific population in a very specific area. And we see the replication crisis in psychology emerge as a result of us, overemphasizing on certain methodologies and, flagging them as gold standards, and others as not being of equal merit.
Yeah, no, and I think design also, and when I say the word design, by the way, because you all, I know, don't know me as well, but I tend to think of design in my world as being more strategic design. So it's not about designing things, but about processes and experiences and systems and whatnot. But yeah, I think in design, especially in that sort of abstract kind of design where we're designing systems, it's harder to kind of quantify things sometimes, right? When the types of evidence that we think about getting, for example, from user research, it's not about surveys or proving things. It's actually about recognizing, are we asking the right questions? Are we designing the right things in the first place? And those can feel, I recognize, to people coming from more of a scientific methodology, like very fuzzy questions. And like, but there's no statistical significance to what we're asking. So I think that is part of the tension also. There are certain things, again, where being able to quantify and measure, and RCTs being a great example of that. Being able to do that is wonderful, but when we start to pivot towards only measuring things that we know we can measure in a quantifiable, accurate way, we leave out a whole bunch of really important things, like understanding just how people sort of perceive differences. And again, I think there's using design as a way of informing hypotheses is part of what I find so interesting, that understanding what it is that we're even solving for. Design has some very different types of tools and techniques that can be sort of combined with the behavioral literature, but can allow us insight in a different kind of way. So that whole tension about like measuring things because they're measurable, I find super fascinating. And I do think that that is sort of one of those modes that we can sometimes fall into way too easily. So it's sort of just a good reminder to all of us, I think, recognizing when that can happen and when we need to kind of guard against it a little bit.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I often reflect on things which I've done in the past which don't necessarily hold true. And was reflecting on an article which I had published in the Behavioral Economics Guide 2016. You can find that's an annual guide which is published every year. And I had written an article on, if you can't measure it, don't do it, and with an obsession that, if we can't find, that we're improving something, there's not really any point improving it. And that was thinking with a very, scientific hat on. And I think common sense is a really good approach to bring. So if you do feel there's a I think there's a common sense approach which one can also take, where you might not necessarily be able to measure an improvement, but you can feel an improvement take place, which is not necessarily quantifiable. There's still a good reason to carry on an experiment or carry on a program or project, even though you can't, statistically measure differences. And I love the commonsensical approach, which, the School of Design and which you bring into the conversation, which kind of keeps us in check. And some of the biases which we bring in, which assumes that something should only be done if we can prove statistical significance, and almost an obsession with statistical significance and getting a paper published, like Thomas was talking about. Yes, many papers don't get published because they aren't statistically significant, but they're quite important findings nonetheless. And finding out what doesn't work is equally important as finding out what works too.
Yeah, no, and I think as a sort of somebody who's, my center of gravity is in design, but applying behavioral thinking, in the work that I used to do before I became an academic, I spent nine-ish years of my life in the design strategy space and innovation. And that's actually, I saw, Thomas, is your question in the chat there as well about kind of what the nature of design is. So the way that I applied behavioral thinking to design projects was by, a lot of the work that I did was in the healthcare and financial spaces. So it was about designing, for example, what's a good way to get people to save more for the future? And I know, of course, there are, solutions and interventions like Save More Tomorrow, which are about sort of more nudge-based, like how do we construct an intervention? And the kind of work that I was doing was working with companies to help them think about like, what are whole new offerings or new ways that their company could sort of build out different types of both products and services or experiences or platforms that could help their clients do things that they wanted to do, so to be able to save. So it was always these sort of intangible things that I was designing. And because I was in a strategy and innovation space, I think the other piece of that sort of measurement thing, which I realize is sort of baked into the way that I think about problems, is that there's often this sort of slightly future-oriented way of thinking about what we're building. When I was working with clients to do design or innovation spaces, it was often about kind of, well, where could their company be in 5 years? Or what could we build in a civic context, for example, because I also did some work in the education space. How can we encourage young people, for example, to figure out trajectories for their educational interests? So these sort of big, sloppy, messy problems, which we're probably going to take years to actually see the outcomes of. So I think that's the other reason why sometimes this sense of what's measurable and what's not, I find really interesting, because many of the problems that I was trying to solve for, you weren't going to be able to measure in a week or a month or maybe even a year. It was about helping people set the groundwork so that we could deliver things that were maybe going to come to fruition in 2 or 5 years down the road. So again, it's not dismissing that measurability is important, but the sense of kind of what can you measure to at least know that you're on the right track in my world was a lot more useful sometimes than knowing that a certain intervention worked in a certain kind of more limited way. So again, I think it comes down to some degree what the problems are that we are designing for, and therefore sort of what are the ways that we go about doing that and what's worth measuring to see if it's working or not. So I guess at the end of the day, it's really like there is no one size fits all, but I do find applying behavioral thinking even to those big sloppy problems really interesting. And there's a lot of potential there, but yeah, I think it's been a little bit less explored, in part because the field in general is a little bit more about like, let's prove the value right now. So it's an interesting tension, I think.
Mm-hmm. I know from our last conversation, we were talking about leading versus lagging metrics. And I think the question which I had posed to you was around how do we measure something when the issue is as complex as climate change or well-being, or, some of these bigger picture problems, which are not very easy to quantify. I'd love for you to maybe share what you mean by leading and lagging metrics and how are they useful.
Yeah. So this idea of being able to see where we're going and to at least measure or find indications. It may be less about measurement, but to sort of notice indications of progress is where this came up. So oftentimes, if we're measuring lagging metrics, that's what RCTs, for example, are quite good at, because we're saying, okay, we did something and what came as a result of that. So that's always, lagging metrics are sort of this backwards view. How do we measure how well something worked? And again, that's super valuable and very useful in a lot of ways, but it also assumes that we have an intervention that's complete and we can sort of set all the conditions to measure things well. What leading metrics can do that's also kind of interesting as a complement is it allows us to say, okay, we want to think more in a prototyping mindset and think about, are things on track? Are we actually making progress towards the things that we think we're doing, or do we need to course correct? And so sometimes looking at leading metrics can allow us to sort of say, okay, nothing has happened quite yet, but is the groundwork kind of being laid in a way that makes sense, that gives us confidence that we'll be proceeding in the right direction? So that notion of kind of iterating on solutions can really take advantage of looking not towards do we achieve success, but kind of are we on the right path? Are we heading down the right direction? And it can allow us to then see where we might intervene or change things a bit, which again, I know is a little bit of a different methodology. Not to say that behavioral designers never do prototyping, but it's often about kind of measuring that end state. And in the design space, often what we do is focus on, well, how can we do things at a sort of a lower fidelity version, just to even be able to test, like, are we asking the right questions again, or are we sort of positioning the right things? So it's almost about figuring out what's wrong rather than testing what's right, if that makes sense. It's just a kind of different mindset about how to understand what's working or not. Sometimes you want to know what's wrong, because then you can kind of backtrack and sort of feed that in. Whereas if you wait until the very, very end just to look for success, you might have missed opportunities along the way to both iterate and improve and kind of make sure that we were moving forward. So I find that backwards looking really important. But when you couple that with more of a future facing way of thinking about where are we going, it can be quite powerful, because it can allow us just more insight into, again, thinking about if we're designing well.
Mm-hmm. And I love the idea about, measuring progress to see if we're heading in the right direction. So it's not necessarily about whether an intervention is successful or not, but, getting a broader picture of, are we at least moving in the right direction, or do we need to pivot or change course at this stage? And I think sometimes we over rely on hoping for the best, and when things don't work, then there's a lot of finger pointing and blame attached to it. And I've seen it with some of the work which I know the behavioral insights team in Australia had done work around CVs and gender equality, and they ran a trial which didn't work, and the media did make it appear that it was a big waste of public expenditure, because there was all this money and time invested, and there was actually a negative impact as a result of blinding the CVs under their trial. But I think setting some of these metrics in place to just capture if we're heading in the right direction is such a useful rule of thumb, so that we're able to steer course in between versus waiting for the end of the intervention and hoping things work. And if it doesn't work, then your job is on the line, which is quite worrying from an innovation point of view, but also from a behavioral science point of view, because I think there's a bit of reluctancy to, testing things which may or may not work. And I like your frame of thinking of setting these, leading and lagging metrics in place. So it's not a binary, yes and no type of answer. I know in your article you also highlighted, which has been a massive influence on me, I must highlight again. You've highlighted this new model of integrating behavioral science with some of the sensibility from design. Maybe to set up things, would you like to share what you mean by the term behavioral design, and why you believe behavioral science can contribute more by partnering with a field like design?
Yeah, no, it is funny because we use these terms very loosely in some ways. So we all talk about behavioral design or behavioral science, but we're probably all sort of using slightly different definitions for those. And one thing which always strikes me as a little bit funny too, and this is getting back to sort of the earlier point as well about scientific methods and design methods being different, is that what's called behavioral design really is still sort of for the most part grounded in scientific methods and sort of the forms of evidence that make sense there. Whereas me as a designer, when I see the term behavioral design, I often think of that as less about solely behavioral change, although that can be part of it too. I often think of behavioral design more as designing with behavioral insight. So it's not always about kind of thinking that, okay, we have a state A and we need to move to a state B. But when we're designing anything, whether it's something which is solving a problem or whether it's creating a really delightful experience, we have so much knowledge about how people think and operate and make decisions and weigh between options. Using that kind of mode of thinking towards all sorts of different types of problems that expand way beyond behavioral change I think is where my starting point is. And so sometimes when I'm either solving problems or teaching my students as well, taking that mindset of how do we design better, even if it's not maybe or sort of designated as a behavioral issue. Maybe this is oversimplifying, but I feel like if there are people involved, it's a behavioral issue. Like you can't extract that away. It's how people engage with things, how they make choices, etc. So there's actually like maybe a good example of that. There's a project I'm working on right now with an organization called, well, the acronym is DORA, which stands for Declaration on Research Assessment. And it's based in the, well, it's not even based in the US. It's a very sort of international set of folks. But their whole reason for being is thinking that when you talk about what quality research looks like, there are all sorts of ways in which the system of academic publishing kind of imposes itself, if you will, on what gets published, right? We were even just talking about this sort of informally at the beginning of this conversation. What gets published, what's considered valuable, how things are chosen, right? If it's going to be in a journal that gets a lot of eyeballs, that's more important, even if it would reach more, dedicated audiences who really can make a difference elsewhere. So that's like this huge sloppy systems problem, because it's about journals and academics and institutions and funders. It's like super sloppy and messy and crazy, but it's also full of behavior and incentives. And like, why do we choose to do one thing over another? Like just dissecting that out and thinking from a systems view, it allows us to now have a way of saying, oh, okay, we're not going to magically solve this. It's a very complex set of levers. I often think of it as rubber bands kind of holding things together. But the more that we understand about how behavioral design can give us insight into that problem, we can start to chip away. We can start to say like, oh, people publish there and not there because they want to get tenure and they want to get a job. Like we know these things, that's not like shocking. But if you don't come in with a behavioral mindset, you may just think in terms, for example, of like financial incentives and not all the other things that we as behavioral folks recognize as being really important in motivating what we do and don't do. So that's the sort of thing you could even, some people wouldn't even think of that as a design problem, but it's totally a design problem. It's a system that somebody designed sort of accidentally. It's like Scotch tape and chewing gum sort of, but it's really, really fixed in place now. So bringing a systems mindset and a designed mindset, and also a ton of behavioral insight to say like, okay, if we're going to tease this really tightly constructed ball of incentives apart, we need to understand why, understanding why people are doing certain things can get us a lot closer to sort of seeing where the footholds might be. So I don't know, that went into like a lot of detail, but it's like, I think that's sort of a perfect exemplar of one of these really challenging problems, which you could argue, of course, when you get down to it, there are lots of behavioral change elements to it, but it's also, I think, on a bigger system scale, just even to tease apart the territory. Having a behavioral perspective can be very, very helpful in helping us see like where those leverage points may or may not be.
Mm-hmm. And I absolutely agree with you that when you're dealing with people, all problems are, behavioral essentially. And we've been working on something with, nudging small and medium enterprises to reduce their carbon footprint, for example. And we can think about business or an entity as disconnected from people. But if you think about who are the people who own these companies or who work in these companies or who influence decision making in these companies, they're people after all, they're not businesses. And the same tools which you use to influence people can be used to influence, businesses to make better decisions or to reduce their carbon footprint. So yeah, I'd like to really iterate that all problems when you're dealing with people are behavioral problems or behavioral challenges, and the toolkits which we have as behavioral designers can be used in these instances.
Well, and just building on that too, I was realizing because I was just literally yesterday talking about climate change and behavior and design. And I think one of the interesting challenges there that you kind of touch on too is that we can think about individual behavioral change, like I as a person I'm going to do something different. But when we think about something as massive a scale as thinking about climate change or addressing climate change, it's not one individual multiplied by all the people in the world. It's about communities and societies, and like that in itself is a very complex set of things. But also we completely recognize that, you know, behavior change is a part of a larger formula, if you will. Maybe that's a terrible way of saying it, but there's you know, thinking about things like carbon credits and social norms and tools that can help us control whether or not we're using electricity at certain times of day. It's I think that sense of looking at a system as something to be solved and looking at behavior impacting that. I think it's a great example of behavioral design working on multiple levels, because it can be about the individual, but it's also maybe about how we think about more societal behavior. And it's absolutely about, you know, how organizations and companies and corporations, for example, think and act and behave. So yeah, basically companies and corporations are just like stacks of people who are all incented to do certain things given like the business model that they have there. But right, at the end of the day, they're still kind of human beings in those places making those choices, even if it's on the behalf of a much bigger institute. I know this makes it sound like, oh my God, we're never going to get to the bottom of anything. Everything is too complicated to even start. But yeah, breaking those big problems down, I think, is part of our job.
We'll get there, Ruth. We'll set the right metrics, and as long as we're heading in the right direction, right?
Exactly.
I was having a discussion last month on the meetup with Verena from Brazil, and we were talking about this documentary titled Your Turn. That's the English title. And the documentary exposes some of the systemic causes for poverty, crime, and inequality in Brazil. And you have students who are demanding an end to short-term austerity measures and the closures of public schools. And they made a very clever argument. So they were arguing that, you know, a lack of high quality public education will only increase government spending, because you can expect inequality to grow in the long term, and you can expect crime to emerge in the long term as a result of unemployment and growing frustration in the country. And I thought it was a very clever way of articulating that, you know, you can't solve you can't solve a very narrow problem with a very narrow lens without expecting an unintended consequence to emerge out of it.
Yeah. No, and I think that's one of the biggest risks possibly of trying to oversimplify these very big problems in order to solve them, is that we take out all the hard parts. If you take complexity and strip everything away that makes it complex, then that might mean that you're solving for symptoms of things. I sometimes have this, this is going to sound very sort of flippant, I guess, but it's like if somebody has a splinter and they also have a broken arm, fixing the splinter is like, it's only going to go so far. So yeah, we need to sort of be thoughtful about looking at large problems and recognizing the complexity that they display. And I think one thing that I do give design credit for doing, not like designers are going to solve for everything by a long shot, but I think designer methodologies are often looking at, well, how do we take something very complicated, like mapping out a system even, to take something large and complicated and start to say like, okay, well, where do we start? We don't start by taking away all the complexity. We start by understanding where it sits and then figuring out, okay, how might we adjust that? So I think that's also sometimes when I have my little pushback on behavioral design that's about like last mile solutions, I think that's hugely useful in some regards, but it can't always be about sort of taking out the splinters and sort of fixing things at the end, because just like you said, if you're fixing things, but the system itself is not equitable, you're not solving for a whole lot. You're actually solving for certain things, and maybe you're solving things for people who already have it pretty easy, and you're making their lives a little bit more easy, but you're not necessarily thinking about sort of some of those more embedded biases that are within systems themselves. So yeah, that systems thinking perspective, I think is, I know in conversations, it feels like it's increasingly getting introduced in behavioral thinking. I don't know that there's necessarily a way that people systematically do that yet. So I do have hope that that's a way in which design can actually start to offer some of that, because I think systems design is a very rich and interesting field, and I think they have a lot to offer to one another. So yeah, having that conversation, well, moving beyond conversation to action, but first even figuring out like, what is it that we can start to do? I do have hope.
Another one for our list. No, I'm very optimistic, and we're increasingly thinking about how we integrate the fields, because there's been quite a disconnect between individual behavior change and thinking about the problem from a systems level.
Yeah.
Something which comes up very often is I think there's a general awareness or understanding that we must be designing with people rather than designing for people, and there's a general awareness, at least in the design community and within service designers and product designers and product owners, that we need to bring in communities and customers into our conversations. But often, I know from the public sector point of view, there's a lengthy consultation process involved, and sometimes a co-design exercise might feel like just a checkbox exercise to show that we've involved others in the conversation. Do you have any tools or ways of thinking about, what does a good co-design process look like? How do we engage people and keep them involved in right through the process?
Yeah, I first of all, I would absolutely agree that having that sort of bottom up, so to speak, being able to actually engage with people who are going to receive these solutions. And sometimes, I mean, you talk about designing with and designing for. I feel like in the worst case scenario, you're designing at people. It's basically like, this is what you need. There's not even a chance to engage at all. I think one of the challenges absolutely is that even the notion that you are designing with people implies a different kind of expertise. I think oftentimes, and this is true in corporations as well, but I think it's probably equally the case in civic arenas, policymakers and very smart people who are making decisions about these things, I think we'll tend to rely on more not just academic expertise, but kind of, they know their stuff. We've studied this for years and we understand the problems. But that sort of learned expertise tends to be very top down. And there's actually somebody who is an adjunct professor at our school who talks about this notion of like learned expertise being learned expertise top down and lived expertise being bottom up. And I think that sense of being open even to lived expertise is itself a bit of a challenge, because you may argue like, oh, well, we know better. We've done this a million times. We have all the data, right? It comes again down to that sense of like, we've quantified things. We tested it. It works. Why don't they want it? So I think there needs to kind of be that groundwork of appreciating the value of understanding and inviting people in. So that itself, I think, is a little bit of a sort of hurdle. It's also just, the notion of it requires a certain amount of humility to step back and say, like, we're going to listen to you. You're going to drive things forward because we may not understand your needs quite well enough to design with you. So there's a certain sort of mentality and appreciation, I think, which is kind of challenging if you've been in a position of learned expertise and power and kind of running the show to invite other people in. So that I think is often a big piece of it. I think another interesting part is also just, we tend as a whole society, we tend to be kind of focused on efficiency. Like, how can we learn enough to get started? And I'm not dismissing that. Efficiency and budgets and whatnot, all important things. But oftentimes, learning from people often feels inefficient initially, because it feels like, oh, well, but we already probably know the answer. Why are we doing this? So there's a certain capacity to sort of sit and recognize that sometimes like go slow to go fast is a term that I've heard sometimes, where appreciating that like we're actually learning more about that what are we solving? We'll be solving the right problem better if we invite that in. But that can be a difficult case to make, I think, if you're used to like, oh, I have this idea, let's get it going. So there's a little bit of rethinking even, I think, how the sort of processes that we work are baked into that. Because in the long run, you end up typically with better solutions. And even more importantly, I think two other things, you build relationships. So when you're thinking about putting solutions into communities, for example, if a community is getting a solution shoved at them, that doesn't work super well in my experience. So inviting people in makes a collective experience, which then makes more sense. And those relationships last longer. So you have both relationships and legitimacy that kind of come as a part of this. But again, those can be a little bit more difficult to measure. And given everything we've been talking about, where like efficiency and measurement tends to be sort of prioritized. So I don't know, probably I'm saying more about like what makes it hard rather than like, here's how to do it. But I think there are a lot of these issues about building that kind of trust and relationship. It will ultimately lead to better things, but we need to flip our sense a little bit of like what progress and efficiency means in order to get there.
Yeah. No, building on what makes it hard, and I think we need to pay attention to some of the barriers. Is I think there's an acknowledgement that short-termism is bad. So urban planners, designers, policymakers will all agree that short-termism is bad. I have been thinking about when we think about problems which impact future generations like climate change. We're talking about people who are we can't invite them into the conversation because they're not yet there, but we need to bring them into the conversation. And I think there's a dilemma. So even though there's an acknowledgement that we need to think more long term, there's also a dilemma that we may not be able to bring some people in the conversation, and we need a new set of tools to think about how we keep their best interests in mind. Sorry, I'm a bit mindful of time. I'll ask you a last question, and I'll take audience questions right after. My final question is just around, do you have any takeaways for anyone looking to adopt humanity-centered behavioral by design to create positive impact? And maybe start with talking about what you mean by humanity-centered.
Yeah, that's right. I usually sort of start with that, and I think we jumped right in. Well, the term human-centered design may be more familiar. I think that's been around for a while. The reason that I like the term humanity-centered design, I know it's just a little bit of a of a change, is that it also, as we were saying before, it shifts the center of gravity from kind of an individual or a singular human into a larger system and societal set of problem solving. It just sort of shifts that space for us somewhat. Because I think, climate change being an excellent example, but I think many of the really important, interesting challenges that would benefit from behavioral insight, again, some of them may be small scale, like are people going to the gym? Do I remember where my keys are? Like there are sort of those like day-to-day really also important things. But I think the potential for embedding behavioral insight and behavioral design into these larger problems, it really is at that larger scale of like, we are collectively doing things and we are collectively working with one another. And so it means designing collectively, both from the participatory standpoint, like we were just discussing, how do we invite people in, but also recognizing that we're designing for people systems, as well as sort of infrastructural systems. And we're also designing into the future. So it's sort of, if we think about behavioral design as this ball, it's almost like how do we stretch that both laterally and longitudinally, if you will. And it's not just to overcomplicate things, but I think like there's just such interesting potential in taking this mindset of looking at things behaviorally and then expanding on it. So we lose some precision, but we gain a really interesting level of scale. because we're focusing on more and different problems, and we're maybe not focusing on solving them perfectly, but we're solving them better. So yeah, it's like giving up precision and control for scale and kind of richness. Like, I'm in that second camp, I will admit. So I think, yeah, when it comes to sort of thinking about how this all applies, there are, thinking in terms of systems, thinking in terms of humanity, not individuals. And absolutely, I think the sense of inviting people in, I think there's a real value to understanding. There can, I think, at its extreme, there can be this way of reading articles or thinking about behavioral insight and saying like, oh, this is about average people, so therefore it must be true to everyone. And I think when you get to know like actual people and working with real people, that's when you start to realize like, well, that's a starting point. That's only the way to kind of begin, and like thinking how that can build into other types of solutions is equally important. So once again, is probably just like a little bit of a starting point, but there's so much for all of us to learn, I think, is part of that.
Oh, thank you for sharing that. You've left us so much with so much to mull over. I'd like to invite anyone from the audience. Thomas, I can see you've written a few comments, but yeah, if anyone else too. Thomas, if you're still around, you can maybe unmute yourself and ask your questions or share your reflections. And yeah, anyone else, feel free to type in your name or your question, and I'll invite you to join the conversation.
And it looks like Thomas had to, he sent me a direct note saying that because he had to leave on the sooner side, so he just jetted.
He did duck out. Emma or Vinay, yeah, feel free to share your reflections or unmute yourself and ask any questions you may have too.
Yes. Go ahead. Sorry.
Oh.
I'll wait for you, Emma. You
we're too polite. Yeah, Ruth, that really resonated with me. Without boring everyone on the call to tears, I'm working in the agile space at the moment, and I've actually started to dig into. But this is why I'm digging into behavioral design and digging into some systems thinking as well, because I'm asked to come in and solve human problems as if there's a definitive solution by slapping some process over the top of it. I guess my question is, where can I look for more information on this stuff? Because I think the biggest issue I have when working with clients is trying to help them to understand the benefit of taking the time to understand the problem before trying to get a solution. And so it would be great if I could have a bit more backing behind me to kind of show them, so actually, it's better to look at the problem first rather than just railroading with that narrow lens that Vishal was talking about there.
Yeah, no, and in an interesting way, actually, and I'm not just trying to sort of sell design, but I feel like design problem framing is probably more oriented towards that, I think, than it's not like behavioral problem framing doesn't do that, but I think because of the narrow focus on behavior, there tends to be a little bit more of a, okay, that's what we want to do, not these other things. And I think from the experiences that I had 100% in the strategic design space when I was working there, it was one of the most useful exercises that we could do to even just expand on, like, here's how you might think differently about what you're solving for. So gosh, I'm trying to think of some like really quick resources. There are some exercises that I've used, which are sort of, they feel a little bit lighter weight, but they can sometimes sort of scratch that itch a little bit too. When we would have people, for example, at the beginning of a project, we'd give them a minute and we'd say, okay, draw a vase or a vase, right? And people would tend to create, something kind of like very concrete and a little flower coming out. And then you'd ask them to say like, oh, or you'd ask them to take another minute and say, draw a way to experience flowers. And you'd get a much wider range of thinking. You'd be able to get sensory input. Like suddenly it was about, the smell and the feel, and it was not about a container, but it was about an environment. so there are examples like that that can, because just saying like, oh, we need to reframe this can sometimes be like, what does that mean?
Yeah.
But kind of helping people to walk through that. The reason I like that example, even though it feels fairly simple, is that it's a really concrete difference. It's kind of like, oh,
Yeah.
are we going to make more widgets, or are we going to reimagine what it is that this experience is actually like? And it makes it kind of very, very evident very quickly. So that's, I'll think of some other ones, and we can be in touch and send you some other things, because there may be some other.
That would be awesome. Thank you.
Yeah, some other sort of thoughtful things too, but that it just absolutely springs to mind as a really kind of visceral way of understanding, oh, like that matters a lot.
I love that. That's so good. And I think with it being simple as well, it makes it accessible to just about anyone.
Exactly.
Yeah.
You don't have to worry about drawing.
Yeah.
You can just give them a Sharpie and a piece of paper and like draw a vase. Everyone can do that.
That's my wheelhouse, Sharpies and Post-its.
Exactly.
Amazing. Thank you.
Sure.
Vinay, the floor is yours.
Oh, thank you. So I won't repeat what I've written on the chat. You can all read. But Ruth, I like this humanity-centered design rather than human, because if COVID has taught us one thing about gratitude, and compassion, and I think there's going to be a lot of catalysts for change around that, but that's a separate matter. But certainly picking up on your point, Ruth, about the vase or the vase, one of the things that I've found very useful is actually doing a persona. So when you are doing a human-centered design work and trying to solve complex problems, and Emma is absolutely right, we need to understand the nature of the problem before we go anywhere near solutions. And what in consulting, it's very common that we have to think about people, process, technology, and data clearly, because there's data is all over the place. And what I mean by personas is whoever's involved in the end-to-end business process and working through it. You have real names like Mary, and you may have Vishal, and you may have Leanne, and these are real people, right, in that organization. And you ask them to think and feel the frustration of the current ways of working, which is not working. So now you're thinking about the process and their frustration and their emotions, etc. And you capture that persona, if you like, and you make it real. And then when you've got all that in an end-to-end business process and all the actors are involved, if you like, then them coming together in a collaborative way means a better holistic solution, if that kind of makes sense. Because now you're taking away silos. You now understanding your colleague better, who works literally down the bloody, 2 feet away from you, but you never frigging talk to, right? So let's kind of get that thing happening. So I like Ruth's idea where you start with that, but then the next thing you can build on is what I call personas. And they're becoming increasingly common now. So you might, I don't know if you've done that, Emma, but you might want to think about that, okay? That's another neat way of doing it. So,
yeah, it's I've been using those actually for the Scrum teams that I work with for creating their workshops, because not everyone likes Energizers where you do daft improv things. So personas I'm very familiar with.
Although that does, please finish.
No, I was going to stop there.
Oh, well, no, it's also reminding me, like thinking about the participatory design aspect too. That's an even more kind of embedded version of getting people to be sort of part of the decision making and the designing. But that can happen with people in your organization as well. One thing that I've seen be very successful, again, this is more from my sort of innovation commercial life than the one that I'm currently in. But when we worked with teams, if I was working for a client who was just like, go away and do things and then come back and show me what you did, they could only judge your ideas, and then it was only based on kind of what they already had in their own heads. So their ability to sort of actually see what was good or not so great or relevant was very abstracted. Whereas when I worked with clients where they were in part sort of incorporated into the project team, it meant that they were able to go along for the ride with you. And there's something incredibly powerful about that. And even better, when we would go and do user research, for example, and when in the user research that I did, it was very generative. It wasn't about evaluating options, but it was about learning about folks. When those clients came along for user research, it was a complete game changer, Like they would
Yeah.
literally years later, they would ask me like, how is Brandon doing? They would remember the people that they talked to.
That's
Because
right.
it was a
I
real
think
human
involving them in the
Yes.
design and embedding them in the solution is key.
Yeah.
Mm.
Yeah, because it means that not only is there that exposure, but so they're learning things along the way, but also, right, it ends up not feeling like, oh, there's this magic that happens, like being able to
Yep.
kind of understand why decisions get made and what that looks like. You're rewiring their brains a little bit in a really productive way. So yeah, so whenever, I know it's not always possible, but that actually is hugely, hugely impactful, I think, for them. Because then they take those experiences back to other people that they talk to. That's the other wonderful thing, is you don't have to be the sole advocate. Like they're now walking and talking advocates for you.
Well,
Yeah,
thanks for
it's
sharing that. I'm a bit mindful of time. Ruth,
Okay.
are you okay to stay with us for about 10, 15 minutes? 10
Yeah,
minutes?
I can go until the quarter of the hour. So yeah, that's perfect.
Okay, awesome. I know, Liana has written a question out there too, and I'm sure she'd like to share it with us. Liana, would you like to join in?
Kia ora. Hi. Yes. Oh, thank you so much, Ruth. Everything's so resonant. And what really struck me as you were describing the different fields of design was these links between the field of transition design, this emerging field that has this emphasis on systems approach, ecologies of projects and the backcasting, but slow knowledge. And I wonder if this emphasis on, as you say, on efficiency and doing things fast, it's from these commercial toolkits that design traditionally use. And I know the author of Beyond Sticky Notes, Kellyanne McKercher, I'm not sure if you've read that book.
No,
amazing, brilliant book around co-designing using models of care to basically combat those commercial tools and methods which don't serve communities so well and can even reinforce inequities as you there's that and I guess where that question's leading to, or where that sort of reflection's leading to, is how designers can be more reflexive to consider their biases, their power and their privilege when we're working in co-design. My master's research, I'm a bit biased, my master's research is going to explore the barriers and enablers to reflexivity. So really wonderful chance to get your thoughts on that or any observations.
Yeah, no, that's I actually literally just this week finished, there's a course that I'm teaching at the Institute of Design where I spend my time that was very specifically on bias and sense making. So it was a course for designers, but it was looking at that very issue. So even, that sense of, like, we started super big picture. So part of it was even just like, what does normal mean, right? Like normal to any one individual of us may be, normal to us, very different to others. How do we think about otherness, right? We can often, kinship can be a really powerful thing, but it can also separate walls, what gets represented and how that influences our perceptions of things. So we sort of went down this whole, starting very, very abstractly, but then ending up in the very point that you're making now, where I think if we as designers are not really, really thoughtful about our own biases coming in, like we can see it certainly on these massive scale in, ways in like the way that algorithms are used that can, again, like you have algorithms that are quite powerful in systems which may be already inequitable, and now you're just like amplifying those inputs and those outputs in a billion different ways, which is really scary. There's a great book by Virginia Eubanks called Automating Inequality. If folks are interested in that, I would actually highly recommend that. It's got a few really interesting particular case studies. But the assignment that I gave my students for that class is actually very similar to what you're describing, where it was, we may not individually be able to fix system biases, but we certainly need to be aware of where they exist. But we can also think about how bias and sense making are part of our very processes. right? So like what gets decided to be made, there are ways in which that is yes, it's a very capitalist decision-making process also, often if you're talking in the commercial world. But yeah, what problems get chosen to be solved, or what opportunities are chosen to pursue? There are biases going into that, certainly in the ways that we work, or in the ways in which methodologies are chosen to either pursue or not pursue, or what good evidence looks like. And yeah, I think that sense of, I often say actually, and we started off this time talking about how the COVID era has sort of increased this opportunity or this need to reflect. I think as a species, we don't reflect nearly enough, actually. And so building that into processes, and I would agree that, yeah, designers have, whenever I teach courses in either behavioral design or bias, actually, I feel like I always need to end it on saying, like, you don't realize how much power you have as a designer. Not in the sense you're taking over the world, but like your ideas and your thinking is going to be driving things, and is going to be choosing certain things and not others. And so, yeah, being able to be very, very thoughtful about how we're implicated in this. I mean, I don't want to make it sound like, oh, now you can't get out of bed because, like, oh, too much pressure. But yeah, I think forcing those sort of internal conversations with yourself are critically important, because otherwise it's too easy for things to go unspoken and unsaid. And because we're in a position of building things, we need to do that. It's critically important. Yeah. Oh, yeah, that's my little, it's so, I feel like that has only entered the conversation more recently, at least in a design school. So I'm so pleased that it sort of is something that we're all wrestling with, even if it's not something that's necessarily easy. Because I think for too long, it went even just like nobody thought about it, which is crazy.
Yeah, and there's some amazing resources that add to the conversation, like the Designer's Field Guide to Power, for example, that was co-created this year. And it's just having something, Emma touched on something earlier, it has to be simple. And I wonder if that's a blocker, and the feelings of discomfort and ego that come up when we wrestle with these and grapple with our own, am I the right person to lead this design, for example, or shifting power to community rather than the designer as expert. So there's a few things, aren't there, that influence perhaps whether or not designers see themselves in the multi-level context that they're designing in, and how they see participants in that as well.
Yeah.
Maybe my research will hopefully shed light on making that easier. But I'm glad. Thank you for pointing out that book.
No, it's really, and it may be very US centric. Now, I mean, I think the examples there, but you could certainly extrapolate from those into any number of other examples. But the other, what you're describing also that just also feels so important is that the way that we, it's not just purely about reflecting on things, but recognizing, for example, that when we are in our professional modes, we are almost without thinking, right? Like nobody wants to look stupid in a work setting or in a professional setting. It's like, it's sort of part of our individual persona to be smart and capable and to demonstrate expertise. And so this notion of sort of being humble and reflecting, and not necessarily feeling like, oh, I need to be the one who like speaks up and like says the right thing immediately. And I'm saying this partially having spent a lot of my career in the consulting world, where being like very confident, very verbal, and very like in the moment is like, that's what's valued. So it actually requires some unlearning, I think, of things that we societally prize, which is a very interesting and challenging thing. It's like, again, getting back to that humanity rather than just human-based. I think it's like we pick up our cues from other people too. So anyway, yeah, no, I hadn't been thinking about that, but that's, yeah, being able to feel like, oh, I don't have to be the smartest person in the room can sometimes be the way to be the smartest person in the room, because you're giving it space.
Creating the environment for that to occur is a really interesting challenge.
Totally. That's super interesting.
Ruth, massive thank you. I know we're running out of time, but massive thank you for taking time off your evening to have a chat with us and share some of your rich interdisciplinary thinking, bringing in so many different schools of thought, and sharing these perspectives with us. Is there any way, and I know we can follow you on your website, which I'll link to this conversation. Is there any other way for us to follow some of your latest thinking and contrarian provocations?
Contrarian in the most thoughtful way, hopefully. Yeah, no, the website is definitely one. I have a Twitter account, which I'm not always super great about adding on to, but that's Ruth K. Schmidt. So those are probably the best ways. And also I'm around via LinkedIn and whatnot. But yeah, no, this was a great conversation. And I think I'm so glad that you reached out and sort of suggested doing this, because I think the other thing that we all kind of, end up in our own little bubble of where we work and who we talk to and all that. And one of the great opportunities, not just because of COVID, but like being able to sort of do this digitally. I wouldn't have been able to fly there for the evening, but being able to do this virtually is just fantastic too. So I really appreciate your having me. And yeah, I very much, I'd love to stay in touch with folks too. I think anyone who's interested in pursuing this thinking and these ideas, just building the community, I think is a hugely important part of that too.
Well, we'd love to bring you to New Zealand sometime.
Someday, I would love to.
Yeah, it was a real delight having you, and yeah, definitely keen to keep our conversation going. And yeah, anyone who would like to connect with Ruth, feel free to reach out to her and continue that dialogue. I think you've planted the seeds for us to think about a humanity-centered approach, and I can see thinking about how ideas evolve and how ideas emerge. I think it's an awesome starting place for us to think about some of these topics which are on the back of our minds, but we don't necessarily have the right words to articulate or the right sense-making tools. So it's been awesome that you've been able to share this with us.
Oh yeah, no, and it's I feel like I've said this probably in different ways too. Dealing and wrestling with these really complicated, big problems require all of us. So yeah, that's one of the reasons that like continuing the conversation and being able to share and discuss with you all is so valuable, because I think we each have different parts of the puzzle, right? So being able to kind of do that collectively, I think is it makes the field better, it makes solutions better. Hopefully, it'll make the world better.
Love that approach. Thank you all for joining us. Thanks for being part of the session. It's always delightful to share a space for us to continue having these meaningful conversations. And thanks so much, Ruth.
Excellent. So yeah, my pleasure. Yeah, we'll be in touch soon. So long.